3 slow knocks, 2 rapid, then silence. In the winter of 1891, in the isolated town of Hollowbrook, Arkansas, this sound became synonymous with death. Families would bolt their doors, extinguish their lamps, and huddle together in the darkness, praying the pattern would not repeat at their threshold. But prayers meant nothing to whatever walked between those snow-covered houses. Between January and March of that year, 17 people died. No wounds, no poison, no explanation. Only the knocks that preceded each death, and the tracks left behind in the snow, tracks that were too large to be human, too deliberate to be animal. The first victim was Abigail Mercer, a 62-year-old widow who lived alone on the eastern edge of town. On the morning of January 14th, her neighbor, Martha Hartwell, found Abigail's front door standing open, snow drifting into the hallway. Abigail was in her bed, eyes open, face frozen in an expression witnesses would later describe as recognition, as if she had seen something familiar, as if she had been expecting it. Welcome to this journey into one of Arkansas's most disturbing and unresolved mysteries. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you right now? What time is it where you're listening? Are you alone? Drop a comment below. There's something about sharing these moments that connects us across time and space, and I genuinely want to know who's walking this dark path with me tonight. Now let's return to Hollowbrook, 1891. Hollowbrook was not a town that appeared on many maps. Nestled in the Ouachita Mountains, approximately 40 miles from any significant settlement, it consisted of fewer than 200 souls. The community had been established in the 1870s by families seeking timber work and a simpler existence away from the rapid industrialization sweeping through America's cities. By 1891, Hollowbrook had a general store, a small Baptist church, a one-room schoolhouse, and a cemetery that would soon require expansion. The winter of 1891 arrived early and brutal. By late December, temperatures had plummeted, and snow fell in quantities the region hadn't seen in decades. Roads became impassable. The town was effectively cut off from the outside world, a condition that would persist until late March. It was in this isolation that the knocking began. Reverend Silas Hartwell was the first to hear it distinctly and report it. On the night of January 13th, at approximately 2 in the morning, he was awakened by the sound. 3 slow knocks at the front door, a pause, then 2 rapid knocks. Silas rose from his bed, took his rifle, and approached the door. He called out. No response. When he finally opened it, he found nothing but darkness and falling snow. No footprints, no sign of any visitor. He returned to bed, troubled but dismissing it as perhaps a branch blown against the wood by wind. But at dawn, when Martha Hartwell went to check on their neighbor, Abigail Mercer, the woman had been feeling unwell. She discovered the widow dead. Sheriff Edmund Crane was summoned. A practical man of 52 years, Crane had seen death before. Accidents in the timber camps, occasional violence, the natural passing of the elderly. But this was different. Abigail showed no signs of trauma, no marks of strangulation, no indication of poisoning. Dr. Isaiah Brennan, the town's only physician, examined the body thoroughly. His conclusion, written in his medical log dated January 14, 1891, stated, simply, cause of death unknown. Heart failure suspected, but patient showed no prior cardiac symptoms. What disturbed both men more than the unexplained death was what Martha Hartwell reported. She had heard it too. The knocks, 3 slow, 2 rapid. Around 2 in the morning, at her door, the same time, the same pattern. And in the snow outside Abigail Mercer's home, Sheriff Crane found tracks. They approached from the woods, moved directly to the front door, and then retreated the same way. The prints were larger than any human foot, deeper than they should have been given the relatively light snowfall that night, and strangely shaped, elongated, with claw-like impressions at the front. Crane measured them, 14 inches long, 7 inches wide. What kind of wolf, he wondered, knocked on doors? To understand what happened in Hollowbrook, we must first understand the world these people inhabited. The 1890s represented a peculiar moment in American history, particularly in isolated regions like the Ouachita Mountains. The frontier was officially declared closed. Modern inventions, telephones, electric lights, motor cars, were beginning to appear in cities, yet places like Hollowbrook remained locked in a previous century. Time moved differently there. News arrived weeks late. Science and superstition coexisted without contradiction. The town's population in 1891 consisted primarily of 5 extended families: the Hartwells, the Mercers, the Caldwells, the Brennans, and the Cranes. Most residents were connected by blood or marriage. The reverend, the doctor, and the sheriff represented the pillars of civil society, but beneath that surface structure lay older beliefs, carried over from the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky, where many families had originated. Folklore ran deep in Hollowbrook. Stories of shapeshifters and cursed bloodlines were not dismissed as childish fantasy, but treated as legitimate possibilities. The forests surrounding the town were regarded with caution. Children were taught never to answer if they heard their name called from the trees. Hunters reported strange occurrences: animals found arranged in patterns, trees marked with symbols no one could identify. The Baptist Church, led by Reverend Silas Hartwell, served as the community's moral center, but attendance had been declining. Some families had begun holding private gatherings, prayer meetings that occurred in homes rather than the church. Silas found this troubling, but attributed it to the harsh winter making travel difficult. The Hartwell family had been among Hollowbrook's founders. Silas had arrived in 1874 with his wife Martha and their young son Thomas. By 1891, Thomas was grown and married to Eleanor Caldwell, daughter of the town's most prosperous timber merchant, Jeremiah Caldwell. The union had been celebrated as a strengthening of community bonds. The Mercer family, by contrast, had fallen on harder times. Abigail's husband, Robert, had died in a logging accident in 1888. She lived alone in a modest cabin on the town's periphery. Some neighbors whispered that she had become peculiar in her isolation, talking to herself, keeping strange hours. Others defended her as simply a grieving widow, managing as best she could. Sheriff Edmund Crane maintained order through reputation more than force. His jail had never held more than 1 prisoner at a time, usually someone sleeping off whiskey. Violence was rare, theft virtually unknown. The community policed itself through shame and social pressure. What crimes occurred were quietly resolved within families. Dr. Isaiah Brennan had studied medicine in Little Rock before settling in Hollowbrook in 1885. He was considered by some to be overqualified for such a remote posting, and there were rumors, never confirmed, that he had left the city under some form of disgrace. His medical knowledge was extensive, his manner professional but cold. He kept detailed records of every patient and every treatment, records that would prove invaluable to later investigators. The winter of 1891 had been particularly hard on the community. Supplies were running low. Several families had exhausted their stores of preserved food and were relying on neighbors' charity. Illness had spread, nothing fatal, but enough to weaken spirits. Children suffered from persistent coughs. The elderly complained of joint pain intensified by the cold. It was in this context of isolation, hardship and simmering tensions that the knocking began. After Abigail Mercer's death, Reverend Hartwell called for a community meeting at the church. On January 16th, despite the snow and cold, nearly every adult in Hollowbrook attended. Silas stood before them and recounted what he and Martha had heard. The knocks, the pattern. He did not mention the tracks. Sheriff Crane had asked him to keep that detail quiet to avoid panic. The gathering quickly devolved into fearful speculation. Some suggested a wild animal had learned to mimic sounds. Others proposed a more human explanation, perhaps someone in town playing a cruel prank. A few voices, mostly the elderly, whispered darker possibilities. Old Nathaniel Caldwell, Jeremiah's father, stood and spoke of legends from his own grandfather's time, stories of creatures that walked on two legs but were not men, spirits that announced themselves before taking a soul. Silas attempted to restore order, to redirect the conversation toward rational explanations and faith in God's protection. But the fear had already taken root. Families began arming themselves. Doors that had never been locked were now barred from within. Some households sat awake in shifts, one person always keeping watch through the night. Sheriff Crane increased his patrols, but one man could not watch the entire town. He deputized 3 younger men, Thomas Hartwell, Marcus Brennan, the doctor's son, and James Caldwell, to help maintain vigilance. They divided the town into sections and walked rounds each night, looking for anything unusual. For 5 nights, nothing happened. No knocks, no deaths. Some began to relax, suggesting that Abigail's death had indeed been natural, the knocking merely coincidence or imagination heightened by grief. Then, on the night of January 21st, the Caldwell family heard it. Jeremiah, his wife Ruth, and their 3 children were asleep when the sound came. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 2 rapid knocks. Jeremiah grabbed his shotgun and shouted through the door, demanding identification. No response. He opened the door to find nothing but darkness and those same impossible tracks leading away into the snow. The family barricaded themselves inside. At dawn, Thomas Hartwell, Jeremiah's son-in-law, went to check on them and found everyone alive but terrified. The children were inconsolable. Ruth refused to leave her bedroom. But across town, another family had not been so fortunate. Sarah and William. Porter lived on the western edge of Hollowbrook with their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9. William worked as a timber hauler and was known for his strength and good humor. Sarah was active in the church, often organizing meals for families in need. They were, by all accounts, decent people with no enemies. On the morning of January 22nd, when William failed to arrive at the timber camp, his co-workers went to check on him. They found the front door ajar. Inside, Sarah lay in the kitchen, collapsed near the stove. William was in the bedroom, both dead. The children were huddled together in a corner, alive but unresponsive, staring at nothing. Dr. Brennan examined the bodies. Again, no trauma, no signs of violence, no clear cause of death. But this time, there were witnesses. The Porter daughters, once they could be coaxed to speak, told the same story. Late in the night, they heard knocking. Their father went to the door with his rifle. He opened it. They heard him gasp. He stumbled backward, and their mother rushed to him. Within minutes, both parents collapsed. "What did your father see?" Sheriff Crane asked gently. The older daughter, 9-year-old Margaret, whispered, "The wolf." "A wolf was at the door." "No, the wolf that looks like a man, the one that knocks." The younger daughter, 7-year-old Anne, added, "He wore Papa's face." These statements, recorded in Sheriff Crane's log dated January 22, 1891, sent a shock through the investigation. Children could be imaginative, especially under trauma, but their specificity was chilling. Crane questioned them separately and consistently received the same description. A tall figure, human in shape but wrong in proportion, too thin, arms too long, and the face, the girls insisted, just kept changing. The town was now in full panic. No one left their homes after dark. Armed men patrolled in groups. Reverend Hartwell held prayer vigils, but attendance was sparse. People were too afraid to gather in one place. Dr. Brennan took the Porter children into his care. hoping time and stability might help them process their trauma. He noted in his medical journal that both girls suffered from persistent nightmares and refused to sleep in darkness. They would only rest if multiple lamps were kept burning in their room. On January 25th, the knocking came to the Brennan household. Isaiah Brennan was awake, working in his study, when he heard it. 3 slow knocks. Pause. 2 rapid. He immediately went to his medical bag and retrieved a vial of morphine solution. He had theorized that perhaps some toxic vapor or gas was causing hallucinations and death, and he intended to protect himself. He approached the door cautiously, looked through a gap in the curtained window, and later wrote in his journal, "I observed a figure on my porch, height approximately 7 feet, posture erect but irregular. The moonlight was sufficient to see that it wore clothing, a dark coat and hat, but the proportions were incorrect. The arms extended far past where human arms should end. As I watched, it turned its head toward the window where I stood. I cannot adequately describe what I saw. The face was human, but only in the loosest sense, eyes too widely spaced, mouth too long, and yet there was intelligence there. Recognition. It knew I was watching. It raised one elongated hand and knocked again, deliberately, maintaining eye contact with me. Brennan did not open the door. He stepped back, closed every curtain in the house, and sat awake until dawn with a loaded revolver in his lap. When morning came, he ventured outside to examine the porch. The tracks were there as always, but this time he noticed something he had not observed before. Partially frozen in the snow near the tracks was a viscous substance, dark, almost black. He collected a sample in a glass vial for later analysis. No one died that night. Brennan theorized that perhaps the thing needed the door to be opened. If one simply refused to acknowledge it, one might survive. He shared this theory with Sheriff Crane, who immediately spread the word. Do not open your door at night, no matter what you hear, no matter who you think might be calling. The town settled into a siege mentality. Families who had been feuding for years now cooperated. Food and resources were shared, children were kept close. But the psychological toll was mounting. People reported seeing figures in the woods at the edge of town, shadows that moved against the wind. Some claimed to hear whispers coming from the direction of the cemetery. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this a creature, a curse, something else entirely? Your theories help us think through these mysteries together. On February 3rd, a discovery complicated everything. Young Marcus Brennan, the doctor's son, was checking the perimeter near the old Mercer cabin when he noticed something unusual. The snow had partially melted near the back of the property, revealing the entrance to what appeared to be a root cellar or storage space. It was common for homesteaders to have such spaces, but this one seemed to have been deliberately concealed beneath loose planking and debris. Marcus called his father and Sheriff Crane. Together they descended into the cellar. What they found would be discussed in hushed tones for generations. The space was larger than expected, extending back into the hillside. The walls were not simply dirt, but had been carefully lined with stones, forming a chamber approximately 15 feet square. And covering those walls were symbols, hundreds of them, carved, scratched, and painted. Some appeared to be letters from no alphabet any of them recognized. Others were geometric patterns, circles within circles, spirals, shapes that hurt to look at directly. In the center of the chamber sat a wooden chair, sturdy and handmade. On the floor around it were scattered bones, small ones, animal bones, Sheriff Crane, determined mostly rabbits and birds, but arranged in patterns, deliberate configurations, and on a crude shelf carved into the wall sat a journal. The journal was bound in what appeared to be deer hide, stitched with sinew. The pages were brittle, some damaged by moisture, but most remained legible. Sheriff Crane carefully carried it back to his office, where he, Dr. Brennan, and Reverend Hartwell examined it by lamplight. The entries were dated sporadically, beginning in September 1890 and continuing until early January 1891, just days before Abigail's death. The handwriting was Abigail's. Martha Hartwell confirmed this. But the content bore little resemblance to the simple widow the town had known. The first entries described Abigail's loneliness after her husband's death, her isolation, her prayers going unanswered. But then, in late October 1890, the tone shifted. "I have made contact with something in the woods. I do not know what to call it. It responds to the old words, the ones my grandmother taught me but made me swear never to speak. I thought they were merely rhymes, superstitions from the old country, but they work. It comes when called." Subsequent entries detailed what could only be described as rituals. Abigail had been conducting ceremonies in the underground chamber. She wrote of offerings, small animals at first, then her own blood, drawn with a needle and dripped onto the stone altar she had constructed. "It promises to bring Robert back to me. Not in flesh, but in visitation. It says death is not an end, but a door, and doors can be opened with the proper knock. 3 slow, 2 rapid, the pattern that echoes between worlds." Dr. Brennan felt his blood run cold reading that passage. The knocking pattern. Abigail had known about it, had perhaps initiated it. The journal described her growing relationship with the entity. She called it the walker, or sometimes the intermediary. She wrote that it appeared differently each time she summoned, it wearing faces of people she knew, people she had lost. Her husband, her father, her childhood friend who had died in an epidemic decades prior. "It tells me that our world and the world of the dead are separated by the thinnest membrane. Like a door with only a simple latch, the walker moves between them freely. It offers to teach me this passage, but the price is high. A life for a life. A door opened requires a door closed." The later entries became more frantic, more confused. Abigail wrote of losing control of what she had started. The walker was no longer coming only when summoned. It was appearing in her dreams, standing at the edge of her vision, and it was asking for more offerings. "I told it I could not provide what it wants. I'm one old woman with no power, but it said the contract was made, the words were spoken, and now the debt must be paid. If I will not choose who opens their door, it will choose for me. It will knock, and those who answer will pay the price. I promised, but cannot deliver." The final entry, dated January 11th, 1891, read, "It came to me tonight without being summoned. It stood at the foot of my bed and told me I would be the first, that my door would be opened from the inside and I would walk the path I had asked to see. I am afraid. I have tried to close what I opened, but the words to seal the door are not in my grandmother's rhymes. God forgive me. God forgive us all." 2 days after that entry, Abigail Mercer was found dead. Sheriff Crane faced an impossible decision: share this information and risk complete hysteria, or conceal it and allow people to remain ignorant of what they faced. After consulting with Dr. Brennan and Reverend Hartwell, they chose a middle path. They would tell a select group, the heads of the major families, and together decide on a course of action. On February 5th, a secret meeting was held in the sheriff's home. Present were Sheriff Crane, Dr. Brennan, Reverend Hartwell, Jeremiah Caldwell, and old Nathaniel Caldwell. They read portions of Abigail's journal. The reactions ranged from disbelief to horror. Jeremiah Caldwell insisted this was madness, the writings of a disturbed woman, and that they were dealing with a flesh-and-blood predator, possibly someone who had read Abigail's delusional writings and decided to enact them as reality. Nathaniel Caldwell disagreed. He knew the old stories. His grandfather had spoken of pacts made with things that dwelled in the mountains, entities that existed before the settlers came. The indigenous peoples who had lived in these lands before their displacement had their own names for such things, their own rituals to appease or banish them. If Abigail opened a door, Nathaniel said, then we must find a way to close it. Dr. Brennan proposed a scientific approach. He would analyze the substance he had collected from the tracks. Perhaps identifying its composition would reveal the nature of their adversary. Reverend Hartwell argued for spiritual intervention, exorcism, cleansing prayer. He would consult what theological texts he possessed for guidance. They agreed to pursue multiple approaches simultaneously, but they also agreed on one critical point. The knocking must be taken seriously. No one was to open their door after dark. No one was to venture outside alone. Yet despite these precautions, the deaths continued. On February 9th, Jacob Thornton, a widower who lived alone near the mill, was found dead. His door had been broken inward, splintered as if struck with tremendous force. Unlike previous victims, Jacob showed signs of struggle. Furniture was overturned. His rifle had been fired. A bullet hole in the ceiling testified to that. But Jacob himself bore no wounds. He lay in the center of his main room, eyes wide open, mouth stretched in a silent scream. On February 14th, the Yates family, husband, wife, and infant son, were discovered deceased in their home. The circumstances were nearly identical to the Porter family. Door found open, no trauma. The only survivor was the family's dog, which had gone mad. It had to be put down when it attacked Sheriff Crane during the investigation. On February 19th, something different occurred. Eleanor Hartwell, Thomas's wife, Silas and Martha's daughter-in-law, heard the knocking, but she did not open the door. She followed the protocol they had established. Yet the next morning she was found in a catatonic state, unresponsive to any stimulation. Dr. Brennan could find no medical explanation. She remained in this condition for 3 weeks before finally dying on March 11th, never having regained consciousness. The pattern was becoming clear. Opening the door resulted in immediate death. Refusing to open it might grant a reprieve, but not necessarily survival. The entity, whatever it was, could seemingly claim victims through proximity alone. Dr. Brennan's analysis of the dark substance he had collected proved inconclusive. Under his microscope, the sample appeared organic, but unlike any tissue he had studied, it seemed to change structure when observed, which he attributed to equipment limitations but found deeply unsettling. Reverend Hartwell attempted several cleansing rituals, reading prayers of protection over vulnerable households. He reported that in 2 cases the knocking occurred, but the families survived the night. He considered this evidence of spiritual protection. Others were less convinced. By late February, 17 people had died. The town's population, already small, had been devastated. Entire families had been wiped out. The survivors were traumatized, exhausted, and turning on each other. Accusations flew. Some blamed the Mercer family line, suggesting Abigail's actions had cursed them all. Others pointed fingers at specific individuals, claiming they must be in league with whatever stalked the town. The social fabric that had held the community together was disintegrating. On February 26th, Thomas Hartwell made a decision that would echo through history. He announced he was taking a group of armed men into the forest to hunt down whatever was responsible. If it was an animal, they would kill it. If it was a man, they would bring him to justice. And if it was something else, well, they would discover what bullets could do against it. 12 men volunteered. They armed themselves with rifles, shotguns, lanterns, and a grim determination. Sheriff Crane tried to stop them, arguing that splitting up the able-bodied defenders would leave families vulnerable, but the men had made up their minds. They set out at noon on February 27th, following the tracks that led into the woods. They never returned. A search party found them 3 days later, on March the 2nd. All 12 men were discovered within a quarter-mile radius of each other, scattered through the forest. No wounds, no signs of violence, simply dead, as if they had simultaneously decided to lie down in the snow and stop living. But their faces, every witness who saw the bodies commented on their faces, expressions of recognition, as if they had seen something they knew, something familiar, something that made them give up. And carved into trees surrounding the bodies were symbols, the same symbols from Abigail Mercer's underground chamber. The winter of 1891 finally broke in late March. Snow melted, roads became passable, and the knocking stopped. The survivors of Hollowbrook, fewer than 100 souls, faced a decision: stay and rebuild, or abandon the town entirely. Most chose to leave. By June 1891, Hollowbrook was largely deserted. The remaining families dismantled their homes, taking what they could carry, and relocated to other settlements. Sheriff Edmund Crane filed an official report with the county authorities. He described the deaths as resulting from an epidemic of unknown origin, possibly related to contaminated water or spoiled food stores. He made no mention of the knocking, the tracks, or Abigail Mercer's journal. The journal itself disappeared from official records. Some believe Crane destroyed it. Others suspect it was taken by one of the surviving families. Dr. Isaiah Brennan returned to Little Rock, where he spent the remaining years of his career in obscurity. Before his death in 1903, he published a single article in a medical journal titled "Mass Psychogenic Illness in Isolated Communities." The article described, without naming, Hollowbrook specifically, how fear and isolation could create shared delusions powerful enough to cause physiological symptoms, including death. The article was largely ignored by his peers. Reverend Silas Hartwell lost his faith. He resigned from the ministry and moved to California with his wife Martha. They lived quietly until their deaths in the 1910s. Martha's personal letters, discovered by a great-granddaughter in the 1970s, contained references to the winter we do not speak of, but provided no details. The town of Hollowbrook was never officially dissolved. It simply ceased to exist. By 1895, all structures had been reclaimed by the forest. By 1900, even the church had collapsed. The land reverted to wilderness. For decades, the events of 1891 existed only as fragmented family stories, whispered warnings passed down through generations. Never answer a knock you don't expect. 3 slow, 2 rapid means death is calling. But in 1952, something brought Hollowbrook back into the light. A graduate student in folklore from the University of Arkansas named Patricia Coulson was researching Ozark mountain legends when she encountered an elderly woman in Mena, Arkansas, who told her about the wolf that knocked. The woman, who identified herself as Margaret Porter Hutchins, claimed to be one of only 2 child survivors of a mysterious tragedy in the 1890s. Patricia interviewed Margaret extensively over several weeks. Margaret, then 78 years old, had never publicly spoken about her childhood experience. She described the events in vivid detail: the knocking, her parents' deaths, the thing she saw at the door. "It wasn't a wolf," Margaret said. "That's just what we called it because we had no other name. It was tall, taller than any man. It moved like a person, but wrong, jerky, like it was learning how to walk in that shape. And the face. It kept trying on faces. My father's face, my mother's face, even my own face reflected back at me, like it was saying, 'I can be anyone, I can be you.'" Patricia recorded these interviews and included them in her master's thesis, Shape-Shifting Folklore in 19th Century Arkansas, Reality or Mass Hysteria. The thesis was filed in the university library, but attracted little attention at the time. In 1967, a team of anthropologists from the Smithsonian Institution conducted a survey of abandoned settlements in the Wichita region. They located the remains of Hollowbrook. Among the ruins, they found the Mercer property and, after some excavation, discovered the underground chamber. The symbols on the walls were photographed and catalogued. Linguists and anthropologists analyzed them. Some appeared to be derived from old European folk magic traditions, possibly German or Celtic in origin. Others bore similarity to Native American petroglyphs found elsewhere in the region. A few defied identification entirely. The chamber was documented, then sealed. The Smithsonian's official report described it as an interesting example of frontier-era superstitious practices and recommended no further investigation. The site was not preserved. Today, it has once again been reclaimed by nature, its exact location uncertain. In 1974, a reporter for the Arkansas Gazette named Donald Kershaw attempted to write a feature article on Hollowbrook. He tracked down several descendants of survivors and collected oral histories. Most were reluctant to speak. Those who did offered contradictory accounts. Some insisted it had been an outbreak of disease. Others mentioned a serial killer who was never caught. A few whispered about things that should not be named. Kershaw's article was never published. The newspaper's editor deemed it too sensational and unverifiable. Kershaw's notes, however, were preserved in the newspaper's archives and were later digitized. They provide one of the most comprehensive collections of secondary accounts. In 1983, Anne Porter Williams, Margaret's younger sister and the other child survivor, gave a deathbed interview to a hospice chaplain. The chaplain, Reverend Michael Thorpe, later wrote about the encounter in his personal memoir. According to Thorpe, Anne's final words were, "Tell them to keep their doors closed. It's still out there. I've felt it watching all my life. It's patient. It waits. And when winter comes hard again, when people are isolated and afraid, it will knock again." Anne died on December 18, 1983, at age 99. In 1998, a cold snap hit western Arkansas. Temperatures dropped to record lows. Snow fell heavily, isolating several rural communities. During this period, the Sheriff's Department in Montgomery County received 3 separate reports of unusual knocking at night. 3 slow knocks followed by 2 rapid. In all 3 cases, the residents refused to open their doors. No deaths were reported. The sheriff attributed the incidents to pranksters aware of the old legend. But one of those residents, an elderly farmer named Curtis Brennan, great-grandson of Dr. Isaiah Brennan, told a different story to a local historian. He said that when he looked through his window during the knocking, he saw something standing on his porch, something tall and wrong, something that turned to look at him with eyes that reflected the lamplight like an animal's. Curtis Brennan moved to Fort Smith 2 weeks later. He never returned to his farm. So what really happened in Hollowbrook, Arkansas, in the winter of 1891? The official explanation, such as it existed, suggested mass psychogenic illness, a community under extreme stress, isolated by weather, low on supplies, frightened by a series of unexplained deaths, essentially frightened itself to death. The knocking was either imagined or the result of natural phenomena misinterpreted through the lens of fear. The tracks were those of ordinary animals made extraordinary by panic. Abigail Mercer's journal represented the delusions of a lonely, grieving widow who had dabbled in folk magic and suffered a mental breakdown. This explanation is tidy. It requires no supernatural intervention. It fits within our understanding of psychology and group dynamics. Cases of mass hysteria have been documented throughout history. Perhaps Hollowbrook was simply an extreme example, but this explanation struggles with certain facts. How did 17 healthy adults die without any visible cause? How did 12 armed men, experienced hunters and woodsmen, all succumb simultaneously in the forest? Why did the deaths stop precisely when winter ended and the town could be accessed again? A second theory suggests a human predator, perhaps a disturbed individual, possibly with knowledge of toxins or gases that could kill without leaving traces. Someone who read Abigail's journal or possibly collaborated with her before her death. Someone who used the legend of the Walker as cover for serial murder. The knocking was theater, psychological warfare, designed to terrorize the community. This theory has merit. It explains the intelligence behind the attacks, the deliberate patterns, but it requires us to believe that this killer possessed knowledge far beyond what was typical for the era. An understanding of poisons or suffocating agents that would stump a trained physician. And it doesn't explain why the killing stopped completely after the town was abandoned. If this was a human predator, why not follow the survivors to their new homes? The third explanation is the one whispered late at night, the one that most people dismiss, but that has persisted for over a century. That Abigail Mercer genuinely contacted something, that her rituals in the underground chamber opened a passage between worlds, that what walked through Hollowbrook in the winter of 1891 was not human, not animal, but something else. An entity that existed in the spaces between life and death, a thing that fed on fear and souls, a walker between worlds, as Abigail called it. This explanation requires us to accept the existence of forces beyond scientific understanding. It demands a belief in the supernatural that many find impossible. Yet it is the explanation that fits all the available evidence. It accounts for the unexplained deaths, the impossible tracks, the descriptions given by the Porter children, the symbols in the underground chamber. And it explains why, even today, people in rural Arkansas sometimes report hearing 3 slow knocks followed by 2 rapid knocks on winter nights. Why some still refuse to open their doors after dark without first confirming who stands outside. Why the story of the wolf that knocked has never entirely died. To this day, no one knows the truth. The ruins of Hollowbrook lie somewhere in the Ouachita National Forest, the exact location lost to time and nature. The underground chamber, if it still exists, remains sealed beneath earth and vegetation. Abigail Mercer's journal has never been found, despite occasional searches by historians and paranormal enthusiasts, but the warnings persist, passed down through families, whispered in rural communities. Keep your doors locked at night. Never answer a knock you don't expect. If you hear 3 slow knocks followed by 2 rapid ones, do not, under any circumstances, open the door. Because something might still be walking out there. Something that learned the pattern long ago. Something patient enough to wait decades between visits, waiting for another hard winter, another isolated community, another door to open. And if you do hear that knocking, if you do see something tall and wrong standing on your porch wearing a face you recognize, remember what happened to those who answered in Hollowbrook. Remember the 17 dead. Remember the 12 hunters who went into the woods and never came back. Remember that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. If you made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment with your theory. Was this mass hysteria, a serial killer, or something that defies explanation? Join our haunted community, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and let's continue exploring these dark corners of history together. There are more stories waiting, more mysteries that refuse to stay buried. Until next time, keep your doors locked, your lights on, and your minds open to the possibility that the world is stranger and darker than we like to admit. Sleep well, if you can.